I'm Ed Waldrop, Master Tech at iCracked, the world's largest on-demand smartphone repair service. In this video, we're about to repair the iPhone 7 Plus. We'll take you through the entire process, but if you're watching this video and find yourself with a broken smartphone, visit iCracked.com and we'll schedule with a local iTech to fix your device today. If you happen to be a tinker, you can also purchase one of our do-it-yourself repair kits from our website. So let's get into it. Before we proceed with this repair, we're going to need to cover a few tools. Now, being this is a 7 Plus, you're going to need tri-wing screwdriver. We've got a nylon spudger, a Pentalobe screwdriver for removing the bottom screws, a Phillips screwdriver, a suction cup, and a plastic pry tool for lifting the screen. The first thing we want to do is go ahead and power down the phone. For those of you who are unaware that if the power button wasn't working, you can do an emergency shutoff of the phone. And by doing that, we used to be able to hold the power and the home button. That no longer works on the 7 and 7 Plus. It's the power and volume down button, and that will perform a hard reset. You'll get an Apple logo and you continue to hold, and then the screen will go pitch black. You release, and now the phone is off. That's what we call emergency off. So let's get started. First thing we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and remove the two screws called Pentalobe screws, which are left and right of the charge port. Now with this shiny gloss black frame, you want to make sure that your tools don't slip and scratch the frame. So now that we have the Pentalobe screws removed, what we're going to want to do is heat this display evenly, warm enough that we can still touch it, but not hot enough to not be able to touch it. You can use a hair dryer or a hot air gun to perform this task. What we're doing is heating this up enough so that the gasket surrounding the frame will loosen up and allow us to easily pop the screen away from the frame. So I'm going to turn on my gun and just very directly and evenly keep hot air flowing across the display. And while I'm doing this, I'm going to touch the display to make sure I'm not getting it too hot. I don't want to put any body parts under the direct blast of that hot air because it's about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit coming out of this depending on the model of hot air gun that you have. Yeah, I think it's pretty warm now. So I'm going to go ahead and take a suction cup and I'm going to place it just above the home button. And on this one, I want to make sure the ring is this way so that I can get a little grip here and start opening this up. So I'm placing my fingers on the outside of the frame. And I'm going to apply a little upward pressure, just enough to where I can get my plastic pry tool in here like that and start breaking the adhesive loose. Now the cables are located right over here, so we don't want to insert any tools that are sharp that are going to damage those cables. So we're going to keep coming up here toward the top. Then I'm going to come around with my plastic pry tool and break the adhesive down both sides. There we go. So now that I've got the screen sort of open at an angle, what I have to do is pull the display downward as there's locking tabs that go under the frame, but not far enough that I'm worried about damaging my cables here. So I'm going to very gently sort of rock this, not using too much force because I don't want to jerk the screen back. And get that open far enough that I can get my plastic pry tool back in here. and get some more of this adhesive removed. There we go. Okay. Now that all the adhesive's free, I can take the screen and open it like a book. Now, the thing you want to do, because you still have your front camera cable connected to the logic board and you still have the cables for the display, is you want to make sure that, let me get some more of this adhesive off, it's sticking to everything. There we go. So you want to make sure the display sits up on the frame edge so that you can keep it open without risk of damaging any of the cables. If you can, remove as much adhesive as you can freely by hand, because we're going to have to remove all that anyway. Now, if you notice here on the bracket for the cables, there's 4 tri-wing screwdrivers. So I'm going to use my 00 tri-wing and remove these 4 screws. Now the key here is to keep your screws very well organized, as not every screw is the same length, and you want to ensure you put the same screw back in the same hole. If you put a long screw into a hole that required a short screw, you could potentially cause irreparable damage to the logic board. Now this screw didn't want to come out, so I left it in there and very gently lifted the bracket with the screw in there. And again, remember, screw organization is a key here. The first thing I want to do is disconnect any power from the phone. By doing that, you've got this cable here, which is the battery flex cable. I'm going to come in at an angle, get underneath the cover here, pop it up. Now that the battery is disconnected, I can safely proceed with disconnecting other components and cables within the phone. Next, I'm going to go to the LCD and digitizer cable and pop it loose. And then the home button cable, and pop it loose. Now that those cables are removed, I have a little more room to work with to give me access here to the bracket where the camera cable is attached. This one is attached with 3 tri-wing screws. So I'm going to go ahead and remove these. Now that my tri-wing screws are removed, I can go ahead and remove the retaining bracket and set it aside. Next, I'm going to come in here and disconnect the front-facing camera cable from the logic board. Now this is the front-facing camera cable, but it also has multiple functions. It's got the front camera, the ear speaker, the top microphone, the proximity sensor, and the ambient light sensor. So you want to take every caution you can to not damage this cable. If one of those components don't work after the repair, then you most likely damage the cable. So now that my screen is completely removed, I'm going to come in here and do a little cleaning. Remove as much of this adhesive as I can. This is best to do while the phone is still nice and warm from the hot air. It'll come up a lot better. And you notice I'm not using any metal tools at all. I'm using nothing but my spudger to bind it up enough to be able to grab it. So I'm going to set the phone aside, and there are several components on the display assembly that are going to have to be transferred to the new display assembly. So we'll get started up here at the ear speaker. So I'm going to begin by removing the Phillips screws located at the top of the phone. Now there's actually 5 screws here. You see there's another screw attached right here to the inside of the ear speaker bracket. And this is definitely going to be a different size than the one next to it, so we want to make sure very clear to keep them separated. Now that that's off, I can go ahead and take the retaining bracket and remove it, set it aside. You notice here we've got the front-facing camera. I can lift that up and grab my ear speaker, pull it out and set it aside. Next, we're going to dislodge the proximity sensor and the ambient light sensor from inside the brackets. Now these are the proximity sensors held in with a tiny bit of double-sided adhesive. So you're going to want to provide a little bit of heat right here to help loosen that. Big thing is don't pull the front-facing camera back too far. You could sever or tear the cable. So I'm pulling it back just enough to get in here and pop this loose. There we go. I'm going to check this, make sure my proximity sensor stayed on the cable, because if this is adhered really well and you don't provide any heat, you'll physically damage this, or it'll remain inside and rip completely off the cable. Okay, the front-facing camera cable here is adhered to the bezel as well. So I'm breaking the adhesive along here to get that loose. You don't want to use any sharp tools because then you could cut or damage the cable. So now that I have this area sort of broken free off the bezel, I'm going to come around here and again apply more heat to this area, loosen up the adhesive along the ear speaker. Now since this is a very tight area, I'm very carefully coming in with the flathead screwdriver, and I'm going to just slightly lift this edge of the flex cable for the ear speaker contacts. As you can see, I'm being extremely gentle, no force, and I'm just very gently lifting it up. There's very little adhesive, but there's enough to know it's there. And then along the top here where the microphone is, I'm going to have to do the same thing. It's a very tight area. So I'm going to get underneath the cable here. And please pay attention to what you're doing. And voila, the cable is now removed. All right, so on black screens and black screens only, you've got this ambient light filter located here. This will have to be dug out and transferred over to the new display assembly. And I would transfer that as soon as possible so that it doesn't get lost. So now that we have the top end of the phone removed, we're going to go ahead, we're going to remove the 4 screws holding the home button retaining bracket in place. Now you can go ahead and lift the home button retaining bracket. And set it aside. Now the home button itself is going to come out through the front and the cable is going to come through. So we have to separate the home button cable, which actually sits on top, from the home button extension cable underneath. You're going to need 2 items for this: your nylon spudger and your plastic pry tool. So you're going to come in here and hold the bottom cable down while taking the pry tool and disconnecting the top half. Just like that. And you can see here is the home button extension cable. Now there's also adhesive along this cable holding it in place. So don't just grab this cable and lift, you will sever the home button that way. So we're going to again apply heat to this area. We're going to get it nice and warm so we can break the adhesive underneath the cable loose. So I'm going to take my nylon spudger and sort of nudge my way in, and you'll see the cable will start coming up. Now I'm putting my finger over the top, and then very, very, very carefully lifting with my nylon spudger to break that adhesive loose, because the last thing I want to do is sever this cable. So I'm taking very slow and very cautious. Now that the cable is completely free, I can pass it right through the display, and there's the home button in all its glory. So the next thing we're going to want to do is transfer the thermal plate over to the new display. There's 6 tri-wing screws down the side and a single Phillips screw located down at the bottom. So I'm going to remove my single Phillips screw. And the thermal plate also has adhesive located here and here onto the cables. So we want to make sure that we don't sever these cables. Now I'm going to take my tri-wing. Now the tri-wing screws on the side are a bit tight, and you could potentially injure yourself by forcing the screw on here and it slips off and punctures your finger. So what I do is I take my nylon spudger and I go, see the little cutout here, as I put that behind where the screw is, come in behind here and break the screw loose. Okay, there's only 5 screws down the side here. So 2 on this side and 3 on the other side. So now I'm going to take the thermal plate and very gently lift it. And see, it comes up pretty freely, except for this area right over here where the flex cable is. So I'm just going to come up under here and very gently break the adhesive loose. See the single piece of tape around there. And then the cables will pass through the thermal plate like that. So you want to make sure that you save this piece because you're going to want to put it back. All right, now the display is completely taken apart, we're going to go ahead and install the new display. So the first thing I'm going to do is pass these 2 cables here through the thermal plate as such, and then over and drop it into place. So I'm going to put my Phillips screw in first down at the bottom to sort of hold the alignment of the thermal plate, because it seems to want to walk around. Okay, and I'm just putting the screw in there enough to hold it. And I'm going to go ahead and lay this down. Okay, now I'm going to put the 5 tri-wing screws holding the thermal plate to the bezel back into place. You notice I'm just putting them in enough to get the threads started. I'm not actually tightening them until I get all 5 in, so that I don't get one side in and then have to fight myself on the other side. Okay, once the 5 side screws are in, I'm going to go ahead and tighten those. You notice I'm not applying too much force here at all, just enough so that my finger rests here. Because if you push too hard on the thermal plate, you could actually damage or crack the LCD. Then I'm going to tighten the bottom Phillips screw. I'm going to take that tape that we removed earlier and put it back in place. As you can see, there's an opening here that goes around the touch IC, which is part of the flex cable. And then I will smooth it back onto the thermal plate. There we go. Now that that's back in place, now I'm going to take my home button here, and you see, one thing you want to make sure is that you didn't damage the home button extension, or that it didn't fold over and get caught under your thermal plate. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to pass the home button through the display enough to where it's flush on the outside, but then you want to make sure that it falls underneath the extension cable here, and then sets in place in the bezel correctly. Now, correctly by the circle here in the flex cable is actually the alignment pin on where it should sit. There we go. You can see the flex cable dropped right over the alignment pin, and then I'm going to press here to make sure it's down. Put the cable down. I'm going to check the end of the home button extension because there is a foam gasket around there. Make sure it's not folded over and inside the pins, otherwise you could potentially damage the connector or this connector, or the foam will roll in and then your home button won't function. So I'm going to hold this down, come over, and you should feel a definite snap of the home button cable connecting to the home button extension. I'm going to take the bracket and go ahead and set this in place. Now the bracket itself does have an alignment pin located right here. So I'm going to insert that one first. Get my tri-wing screw, And again, I'm just going to get the thread started. I'm not going to tighten it all the way down yet. Okay, so I put the one down here on. Then I'm going to go all the way to the opposite end and place that screw in. Again, I'm just going to start the threads. Be mindful of your tools. Tri-wings are a little difficult to play with, and it can easily slip off the screw and puncture a cable or fracture the LCD. And then the last screw is the one that physically goes into the back side of the home button itself. Once all 4 screws are in, I'm going to go ahead and tighten them. Don't over tighten these, just enough to where they stop. There we go. So as stated earlier in the video, I immediately transferred my ambient light sensor filter over to my new display. So make sure that's in place, otherwise it's not going to function correctly. And what this does is when you walk outside, it dims your screen, and you walk inside, it brightens your screen. That's what the ambient light filter does. So I'm going to remove the adhesive backing for the microphone. I'm going to take my cable, and I'm going to start in the area where the ear speaker contacts are. Is the cable's got these alignment holes, and I'm going to place them over the 2 holes here in the bezel. And then the cable should lay right down naturally into place. Now this area of the cable, if it unfolded like mine did, I did this so I could show you how to do this. It just simply folds over like that. And then this area here, which is the proximity sensor, proximity sensor will sit in this bracket. And this area with the rubber boot is the ambient light sensor, which sits in this area. So I'm going to flip this around very carefully so as not to damage it. So the first thing I'm going to do is flip the cable around and place the proximity sensor into the proximity sensor bracket. It should sit nice and flush. And then take this area and set it down so it sits inside the ambient light sensor socket. And your cable, when you let go, should stay in place like that. So next I'm going to take my ear speaker and I'm going to put it back into place. So fold the cable over and set the front camera back into its bracket and over the top of the ear speaker. I'm going to take the ear speaker and front camera retaining bracket, place it over the top of the ear speaker so that it sets into place, and should, with no force, all the holes should line up. And then I'm going to insert the 5 Phillips screws, holding this down. Then I'm going to go through and tighten the 5 screws. Again, don't over tighten them. You don't want to strip this out. And they are in close proximity of the glass. If you over tighten them, or if you insert the wrong screw in the wrong hole, you'll end up with circles in the front of your screen where the screws scraped away all the paint. Now the display is ready to go back onto the frame. But first off, we have to apply the new gasket to the frame. So I'm going to go ahead and set the display aside. Now before we apply the gasket, We're going to make sure all the old adhesive is off. Whatever isn't, just use the plastic pry tool to sort of push it around, or use the flat end of the nylon spudger or the pointy end just to push the last remaining adhesive and pull off. It comes off relatively easy. Now this is the replacement gasket that we're going to be applying. There's two different ways that you can do this. One way is to peel off the outer one. Well, both ways you're going to peel this piece off. And you're going to try and align this down using this area here, of course, as your rear camera and so forth, and try to get this down inside the frame, which can be done very easily, but coming soon, we're going to have this simple tool to be able to do this for you. So the gasket itself has this oval cutout and the circle, which puts it inside this plate. Okay, now before I lay this on, I'm going to fold the battery cable over and temporarily reconnect it so that I have clearance to be able to apply the gasket in this little tool. So I'm going to take this, and again, rear camera. I'm going to set this in here as close as I can, lay it down, press the frame. There's a little racetrack around there that recess up into the frame, so that's how this comes in. Then I could lift this up, and voila, my gasket is now applied in the correct location all the way around. So I can come with my nylon spudger and just smooth this out and get it into the frame. I'm going to pull this top blue layer off. And that leaves me with two other pieces to remove, which is kind of nice because the 6S version of this adhesive, if one side pulled it, it kind of ruined it for you. I'm going to take the opposite side, remove it. Yep. And then, so this slipped a little, there we go. Okay. Then I can go ahead and peel that off. There we go. Now our gasket is reapplied inside the phone. I'm going to come back in, and remember we connected our battery, so we want to re-disconnect it because we want all power removed when connecting or disconnecting cables of any kind. So just like in the removal process, the first thing we're going to do is reconnect the front-facing camera and accessory cable. So I'm bringing this down so that I have enough room to be able to get this and see what I'm doing. The cable will fold over under itself, and you should be able to pretty easily align it and push it into place. I'm going to take the camera retaining bracket, set it back in. Try not to let your fingers grab the gasket anywhere around the edges, because if it comes off, you'll have to get another gasket and reapply it. Again, be mindful of your tri-wing screwdriver. You're working pretty close to the logic board and the battery. If this screwdriver slips off and it punctures that battery, it can immediately start a fire. I've seen it happen. Again, remember these tri-wings, they don't like to stay on the tip of the driver very well. Okay, now I've got all three screws tightened. I'm going to slide the display up so that I can connect the home button and the digitizer back onto the logic board. I'm going to come around here. This cable sort of folds inward. Should be able to easily align it. Now, if the cable feels like it's not aligned, do not force it in. You will damage the connector on the logic board and render your phone irreparable. There we go. So now that it's nice and flat, and you'll see it sitting inside the phone, we'll come around with the LCD and digitizer and reconnect it to the logic board. You should feel it snap at both ends. Don't force this down. The last thing you want to do is destroy the logic board connector. Now that both of those are in place, I'm going to go ahead and reattach the battery. Now if you notice that the battery flex, you got to kind of give it a little nudge to push it toward the battery before it'll drop into place. And we'll take the retaining bracket, set it back over here. Now the longest of the 4 screws here is the one closest to the frame's edge. I'm only putting in enough so that the threads grab. I'm not actually tightening it yet. Again, be very mindful of your screwdrivers. Don't let them slip off and puncture or damage other parts of the phone. Okay, once all 4 screws are in, I'll go ahead and go through and tighten these. Again, I'm not over tightening them, I'm just tightening them enough so that to where the screw stops movement. Okay, let's go ahead and power on the phone. Make sure that the display still functions before we actually close the phone and destroy the gasket. So you notice I am holding the display away from the frame to keep it from adhering to the gasket. Okay, so I'm going to grab a single icon. Okay, force touch is working. Home button is working. Fingerprint scanner is working. Then I'm going to grab a single icon and move it all over the screen. And the icon should not drop unless you lift your finger or there's a dead spot. Want to make sure both cameras function. Make sure that your video recording from the front microphone where you transferred it. Test 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. Test 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so the ear speaker's working. It's also an additional loudspeaker. The microphone's working because it recorded the video. Therefore, I'm satisfied that everything that I touch on the display is functional. I'll go ahead and power this device down. While it's powering down, I will go ahead and reconnect it. If you look at the very top of the screen, you've got these clips along the bezel that sit inside and under the frame. So you've got to bring this down to where you have a bit of a gap and a slight angle on the display and push this up to where it's flush with the edge of the frame. Come down, keeping force from the bottom toward the top, snapping in the bottom, and then walking your fingers up the sides. So now I'm going to go ahead and power the phone back on. While it's booting, I'm going to go ahead and insert my 2 Pentalobe screws. Again, on the high gloss phones, you really want to make sure your tool does not slip and scratch your frame. We've successfully repaired this phone. Thanks for watching the iPhone 7 Plus display assembly replacement video. Remember to visit iCracked.com for all your mobile device repair needs.